Well, welcome to today's VIP chat. I'm Victoria Cobb, president of the Family Foundation. We are thrilled to have you, some of you back this week, hopefully a few of you for the first time. As word has gotten out, we've had some fantastic conversations with some Virginia insiders. We spoke with Delegate LaRock and Senator Newman, Delegate Byron, right after veto session, talking about what happened there. Last week, we had a great discussion about I would argue, a little bit lesser known topic, which was the Electoral College, why that matters, why we don't think the National Compact is the way to go. Talked about the fact that we want Virginia to still have a voice and not have our decisions made for us by California or New York. So we had a great conversation. Hopefully, if you were with us last week, you learned something. If you've been a part of registering for these events, you probably received the ability to also see the recording. If you didn't catch it in the moment, you should be able to get that after the fact. But if you're joining us this week, we've had a lot going on at the Family Foundation in a variety of fronts. I want to make a couple announcements before we get to today's conversation. The first one is we have recently announced our big simulcast, our benefit simulcast. We are doing on June 1st. We're getting very, very excited about this. This is an event that you can join us virtually, of course, because we'll still be in our shelter in place, whatever the heck we're calling it these days, Forward Virginia, whatever marketing name we're using for the fact that we are not yet back out in doing all of our activities. But on June 1st, from 1 to 4, maybe a little bit shorter than that, we're looking at the time frame, we are going to be looking at redeeming the crisis, talking about how the pandemic actually points us to the conservative principles. We're going to look at everything from the family, how we're all home with our families and experiencing the value of good family life. And Dr. Jim Daly from Focus on the Family will be doing a segment with us on family. We're going to be looking at life, not just, obviously we paid attention to the issues of abortion being, quote, an essential service where churches somehow weren't, those kind of things, but also looking at the discussions started early on, thankfully, that have not come into play, but about what if we run out of ventilators? How do we make decisions on human life? Big issues that matter and why we need to have a culture of life for exactly these moments that we find ourselves in today. We're going to talk about education. John Stonestreet from the Colson Center. I think I just prematurely announced some of our speakers, by the way. I guess you're getting the inside stick here, but John Colson's going to talk, John Stonestreet from Colson Center is going to talk about education, and we're also going to talk about religious freedom and what that means in this moment. So it's going to be an awesome event. You can get that information and register on our website. We'll be announcing, I guess, the rest of the speakers, some of which I just shared with you, we'll be announcing officially over the next couple of days and weeks, but we're getting excited about that. So I wanted to put June 1st on your calendar because you're going to want to be a part of that. It is actually an event that we're doing to raise funds. It's a free event for viewers, but we're hoping folks will sponsor the event because it's replacing a lot of our spring receptions that were to benefit the mission of the Family Foundation. So consider whether you want to be a part of sponsoring that or at least attending it. It's going to be fantastic. Another announcement, we are doing another webinar tomorrow, and that is specifically for school administrators and folks involved with private schools, and we're discussing religious freedom. As you know, the laws changed this General Assembly and will go into effect July 1 on issues of non-discrimination, and those have tremendous impact on both churches and schools that are entities of faith that have tenets that they hold on to that align with traditional Orthodox views on marriage. And so we met with pastors last week, had a great conversation about how they prepare and what the litigation will look like as it goes forward, because no question this infringes on First Amendment rights of churches and we believe of schools. And so we're going to talk about that with schools now tomorrow. So if you don't know about that, but you're connected to a school, on a school board, part of the administration, that link is also on our website. So I wanted to make sure you were in the loop on that. And then I'll simply announce we are getting close to summertime. A lot of folks know it as our Worldview Academy. We have a student program for kids over the summer, college kids typically, upper high school if they're really ready for it. Happens every Wednesday from June and July, and it's really just focused on how do we ground our foundational truths so that as we go through the college experience, we're interpreting things that we're hearing and seeing in the classroom and in our lives and in politics through foundational viewpoints. And we go through everything: life, marriage, constitutional government, all sorts of stuff. This is now called Equip. So if you see on our website banner for Equip, that's what we're talking about. So if you have college students, or you are a college student, and you have them in your lives, that is an awesome opportunity. So I'm just making a plug for that as we get a little closer. The first week will have to be virtual, as you know, because again, we can't have more than a ton of people in a location at that point in the beginning of June. But again, awesome program. Really wanted to make sure people knew about that. And again, available familyfoundation.org. And then the last announcement I'll make before we get to our talk today, which I'm really excited about, is next week's VIP chat. Next week, we will have on this VIP chat really a situation we've gotten involved with, a woman named Cheryl Britt. You wouldn't know her name, I wouldn't think, unless you're in Virginia Beach doing maybe some pro-life work, but Cheryl Britt is a pro-life activist out in Virginia Beach. And Cheryl was one of the first victims of, I would argue, inequitable application of the governor's orders. So we know that he made abortion facilities essential during this shelter in place, but shut down all sorts of non-essential businesses. Interestingly enough, when Cheryl Britt shows up with her mobile ultrasound unit outside the abortion center to talk to women, to offer an ultrasound before they head into the local abortion center, she gets cited for violating that order. Now remember, key fact here, until July 1 in Virginia, you have to have an ultrasound for an abortion. So abortion is essential, but apparently her service offered from a pro-life perspective, not essential. The Family Foundation, and we may have already mentioned it here first, it's not publicly announced, but we're opening a law center. We're really excited. I'll hold the announcement of its name and all that stuff, but we're opening a law center starting July 1, but we're already working with Cheryl Britt to help her with her citation, the fact that she got a charge for violating the governor's orders. So we're gonna have her come talk about her experience and what it means to be a pro-lifer and constantly have your viewpoint really discriminated by even local authorities. So we're excited about that chat. That's next week. Stay tuned for that. And now to get into the bulk of why we're here today. In the first several weeks we did this, we were talking with legislators and had a lot of questions from folks about elections. People are wondering, okay, when are they? Have they been moved? Did the General Assembly change their laws? We were doing a lot of that, and frankly, it is a bit of feels, when you're not knowledgeable about it, a little bit like the Wild Wild West right now, because it does feel like there's some moving targets. Some of us sit in congressional districts where, frankly, you know, we've been waiting for like a convention that was supposed to happen in order to nominate our candidate for Congress, but that convention hasn't happened, and we don't know if we ever can have a convention. All that stuff is complicated, and with all the questions we got, we thought, need somebody that can just kind of walk through what we do know about elections and what has changed and how that's going to impact the elections. And so all of a sudden it dawned on me that I am friends with someone who knows a lot about this. So today we're excited that Chris Piper is going to join us. He is our Commissioner of Elections here in Virginia. I've known Chris for a lot of years. You know, he is one of the few others that have been in this general election space, or general political space, I guess I should say, for, I feel like the entire time I've been here, which is now 20 years. I hate to admit that because I feel old, but it's exciting that there are people like Chris that stay in it, and I stay in it because we believe in it. And he's had a variety of roles, typically though tied to lobbying, registrations, and ethics issues, and now elections. So we're real excited. You know, Chris, some of you actually may know him if you're in the Richmond area from, he's big in the running community. He's always helping training the rest of us runners who aren't quite at the level that he is at. But it's exciting to know Chris and to have him on. So I'm going to turn it over to Todd Gackey, who is our head of our legislative affairs area at the Family Foundation. And he's going to bring on Chris Piper now also. And I'm going to let them have a little conversation. Now, I want to make the announcement I always forget, which is if you have a question, you have a chat box. There's a question box that will go directly to Todd, and then he and Chris can chat and bring that question up at the end. So make sure you get your questions in. And at that, I'm just going to let you guys have a great conversation. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, Victoria, and thank you for reminding everyone about the questions. Yeah, again, it's in the chat box area. It's listed as questions, so you can key in your question, and at the end, hopefully, if we have time, we'll take in field a few. But Chris, we're so thankful that you're here joining us, and just so you know, we've had several of these chats, VIP chats, and we do receive a lot of questions about elections, and those that have been on the VIP chat really didn't have the immediate answers, and just a lot of questions. We're hoping we can maybe flush this out and get some more information out there for those that are joining us on this webinar. But before we get into that, just kind of just share with us how you're doing, how you're enjoying your stay-at-home time, and how that's impacting your agency as well.
Well, elections has always been kind of an in-person game. You have to be around for it. So I was incredibly nervous when the stay-at-home orders were issued and the teleworking orders were issued. But I have to say, the Commonwealth has stepped up. We've had no technology issues. The communication between the teams in elections has been top-notch. It's been great as far as that's concerned. We've been working very, very closely with the localities, which obviously we've always done kind of virtually anyway, and through teleconferences. But it has been, it's been a struggle, just like everybody else. Personally, professionally, it's been tough. That said, I think that we've settled in. We're getting, we're obviously in a much better place than we were when this all started, and I feel very confident about the direction we're going, and I'm pretty optimistic that it's a different world, just like we all know, but we are working for the safety and security of the elections and for the safety and security of our election officers and the voters themselves.
Yeah, it's been really busy. You had a very busy General Assembly session. A lot of election bills, a lot of bills that have been passed, signed into law, and then on top of that, you add in COVID-19 and the challenges and what that presents to you and your role and your staff. I'd like to just go through and start off with some of the legislative challenges, maybe just or changes, and just kind of take them one by one. Really, maybe we can start by talking about the repeal of the photo ID and what, if you could discuss that legislation, what it was, and maybe how that impacts your agency.
Sure. So as Victoria mentioned at the top, I've been involved in governmental ethics and elections pretty much my whole career. So I actually was with the State Board of Elections when photo ID was enacted, and I was also there prior to photo ID being enacted. So essentially, what happened in the General Assembly session this year is we call it a repeal, or you can call it a repeal, but it went back to the way it was prior to the enactment in 2013. Essentially, your ID will still be requested when you get to the polling place. If you do not have an ID, you can provide any other proof of residence, like a utility bill. Not any other proof of residence, but there's a utility bill that you could provide. If you don't have any of those items, then you're offered an affirmation statement, and you sign that statement under penalty of law that you are who you say you are, and then you're able to cast a ballot. So that's what will go into effect beginning July 1st. As of the primary on June 23rd and the election on Tuesday, May 19th, the photo ID is still required in order to cast a ballot. Okay.
How do you think this is going to impact the election officials, on election day when when this change goes into effect? Do you anticipate longer lines, a little bit more time to verify information? What are your expectations going forward?
Well, I don't think it'll have too much of an impact at all. If somebody shows up to the polls without their ID, they'll be moved over to discuss their options and be provided the affirmation. We never had any major issues with that. For the most part, I think it's very rare that somebody doesn't present a photo ID. So I don't anticipate major changes to wait times or anything like that as a result of the new photo ID or the new law. that said, we will be providing a lot of guidance and updated training to our election officers to ensure that they are prepared and know exactly what to do when when a situation arises.
Okay. There were also some changes to absentee ballots or mail-in ballot requirements. Can you discuss what they were and how that's going to impact the election process?
Well, the most notable change is actually in 2019, the General Assembly passed a bill allowing for, in the last 7 days of absentee voting, that people could arrive in person and cast a ballot without an excuse. That was lifted entirely, so there is no excuse required in 2020 for to cast an absentee ballot. And I should say that all of this law, the law in 2019, was applicable only to the 2020 election, the 2020 general election. So as of July 1st, under the law that was passed in 2020, you will not need an excuse to cast a ballot for an election. So we have revised the absentee ballot application. You still have to apply. You still have to request one. And when you do that, you can do that online, or you can do that through the paper form, which is also available on our website. But when you do that, you make the request, and assuming that you're a registered voter, you'll be provided an absentee ballot. Okay.
There were also some changes to registration laws, voter registration. Can you kind of go over what those changes were and the impact, the administrative impact this will have?
Well, there is automatic voter registration. It will be implemented over the next few years. That I think, I guess, is the biggest change. But most of that's not going to be applicable until 2022. So voter registration, for the most part, stays the same as we go forward this year.
Okay. I think that some of the questions or concerns that we have or that people have, is voter fraud. I think that's always on anybody, whether it's a legislator or an administrative official. Can you address what your agency currently does to prevent voter fraud?
Absolutely. So, the studies have shown, obviously, that voter fraud is pretty rare. However, we always want to take whatever steps we can to ensure that we eliminate it, if not entirely. One of the best, most effective methods that we have, Virginia is a leader in list maintenance. And we had a JLARC study done on us in 2018. And one of the findings was that we had a very robust list maintenance program. And what is list maintenance for the general public? So list maintenance is ensuring that our voter rolls are as accurate as can possibly be at any given time. And this includes checking our lists against other states. So we were a founding member of what's called the Electronic Registration Information Center, otherwise known as ERIC. ERIC now has about 31 states as members. And what we do is we provide our voter registration list and our DMV list, and that's compared with all the other states that are members of ERIC. That helps us identify voters who have moved, who have registered in other states, who have maybe done a transaction with the DMV at other states. It has a very, very strong matching algorithm, so we know, very clearly who that person, if that person is the same person. And then we go through the process of reaching out to those people to ensure they did in fact move. So we don't rely 100% on that data. Other sources of data, we work with the Virginia State Police in providing felon data. So if a person is convicted of a felony, we have that information in our database. We look at the Department of Vital Statistics and the Social Security Administration and their master death file. So as people are deceased, we can find them and remove them from the rolls, and a number of other sources of data that we use and compare our lists against to ensure that our data is as accurate as can possibly be. And we've been noted over the years for our incredibly strong list maintenance program. Knowing who these folks are, and being able to remove them from the list. And then also the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 requires us to check our list against the National Change of Address list from the United States Postal Service. So there's another source that we go in and make sure that our lists are as accurate as possibly can be. Strong lists are the key and the fundamental to ensuring against voter fraud.
Okay, that's a great description for everyone. I think that, yeah, that's always on somebody's mind, and I appreciate your willingness to address that question. Let's kind of transition into the upcoming elections. All right, there's rumors, there's dates that have changed. Can you just kind of give us a rundown of just sort of the main state, federal elections, the dates, if they've changed any, and just bring us up to speed on that?
Sure. There's been, a lot of changes. I think the biggest thing I can say about the pandemic and elections is that there's no playbook for what we've done or what's going on and how to react. But the good news is election officials across the country, and especially in the Commonwealth, we are master contingency planners. So we think of every deep, dark rabbit hole you can go down and then plan for it. And it can sometimes be a scary situation, but we're prepared. So just to go through the schedule, we originally have every year, some cities or towns have an election in May. And this year's was scheduled on May 5th. The governor, concerned about the welfare of the voters and the election officers, proposed to the General Assembly to move that to November. The Senate chose not to agree with that proposal and kept the election as May 5th. Under the code, the governor has the authority to postpone an election up to 2 weeks, and the governor implemented his authority under that code section and moved the election to May 19th. So that's where we're at. We have over 100 cities and towns and 56 localities that are hosting an election on Tuesday. And I can go into some of the preparation that we've done a little bit later, but they're ready to go. We have a lot of preparation involved, and we're confident about how that election is going to go. Then, of course, every June in Virginia, we have a primary, and this year's primary was regarding a statewide Republican Senate candidate primary, as well as some various congressional primaries throughout the state. That was originally scheduled for June 9th. The governor also postponed that election to June 23rd. So now that election will be held on June 23rd in every locality in the Commonwealth with a statewide Senate run. That means that everybody's going to have an opportunity to vote. And so we're all set for that. We have a couple of special elections scheduled in July, and we have, of course, the November general election. And before I forget, there were 3 towns in Loudoun County. Under the code, they were allowed to petition the Supreme Court, the Virginia Supreme Court, for a delay. They did get that request granted by the Supreme Court, and those elections in those 3 towns have been moved to June 4th, which is a Thursday. So that'll be our first Thursday election in the Commonwealth. So everything is a little upside down, but we're gonna be ready for those elections up there in Loudoun as well. But of course, we have the November general election, and we fully anticipate that one to be on November 3rd as planned, and we're getting ready for that as we speak as well. Okay,
that's great information. I know things are always kind of changing, but is there a great website that people here can go to? You can kind of spell it out, and we can put it into the chat for them to be able to go to it. And is it kept up to date, I guess would be another question.
100%. So it's elections.virginia spelled out .gov is our website. There you can see the calendar of elections. You can also go in and check your voter registration status. You can apply for an absentee ballot there. You can also check where your polling place is, and that's actually going to be a very critical piece of information coming up for the June 23rd primary, and again in November. And if you're lucky enough to be able to participate in the May 19th election and you want to vote in person, this is an important area to go to. because of the pandemic and because of the need to, in some localities, change polling places because A, they may not be available, or B, there may be a need to consolidate where they can. The code is very specific on how polling locations are set. But in some localities, they've had to move their polling locations. And so if you're used to going to, elementary school A, it may not be a polling location this year. It may have moved to a different location. So we really encourage you to go to our website or contact your local general registrar's office to ensure that you can get to the right place. Now, that said, if you forget, in every locality, if you go to that location, there will be signs up directing you to the new place. So it's important to check that information though beforehand to save yourself some time, because you want to allow for a little extra time at the polling locations this year, simply because of the pandemic and the need to social distance, and there may be some slight changes to protocol that you wouldn't necessarily be used to.
Those are great tips. Yeah, please be sure to check to make sure where your polling place is before you leave the house.
Absolutely.
You mentioned primaries, and this may be more of kind of a personal opinion, but maybe you can give us some insight. Here in Virginia, it's open primaries. What are the challenges, or what are the benefits to this? If you can maybe kind of comment on that. I know that this comes up a lot here in Virginia, and especially for those who move from out of state where it's a closed primary. Maybe you can kind of touch on that.
Sure. So Virginia is an open primary state. There's a bunch of us out there, but in most states, people register by party. So when they register or apply to register to vote, they have an opportunity to choose many different parties, depending on the state. In Virginia, you don't register by party. That means when we have a primary, it is open to anybody. So if right now we have a statewide Republican primary, if you identify as a Democrat, you can still show up to the polls and request a Republican ballot and cast your ballot in that primary. In some localities, you may have, especially congressional districts, you may have a dual primary. So when you get to the polling location, you may be asked, do you want a Democratic ballot or do you want a Republican ballot? In that case, you get to choose, but you can only choose one. You can't have both. The other benefit to an open primary is if you want to participate this year in the Republican primary, but next year you want to participate in the Democratic primary, well, then that's fine too. But you can't participate in both at the same time. That's the main key. As far as the difficulties, just from an administrative standpoint, the biggest issue is when somebody comes to the polling place, they're asked, do you want a Democratic ballot or a Republican ballot? And some people are frustrated by that because they don't want to publicly announce which ballot they want. But those are the rules in the code. And this is actually just kind of an inside elections frustration, if you will. Last year, Senator Kaine was not on the primary ballot because he didn't have a primary opponent. And so we had a lot of people calling up in frustration because they wanted to vote for Senator Kaine. But to show that this is a bipartisan problem, we had the March presidential primary, and we had a lot of people frustrated that they couldn't go to the polls and vote for President Trump. And so it's just it's an issue that we run into in every primary election. But as far as administratively, there's just some minor details that we have to work out. But we're experts at it in Virginia, and as long as that's the law, that's the way we'll be able to implement it.
All right. That was a fun question and answer right there. Let's kind of transition into the impact of COVID-19 on the election. So the governor's executive order number 55 requires all Virginia residents to remain in their places of residence except to leave for certain purposes, except shopping and seeking medical attention. There's no allowance for voting. How will this impact elections, I guess, as early as May, particularly for Northern Virginia localities?
Yeah, so actually, in the executive order, there's an exemption for critical functions of government, and elections are considered a critical function of government. And so that's where you get the exemption and allowance for some relaxation of those rules. That said, Virginia election officials have been working overtime to ensure that the polling places are set up in such a way to ensure or help ensure the safety and sanitary conditions of the polling place and the voters and the election officers. So along those lines, you know, a lot of localities have produced their own signage, which will make very clear how to maneuver about the polling place in a way to ensure physical distancing and social distancing. There will be tape in many localities and many polling places to ensure physical distancing. In some cases, you'll be voting outside, you know, under a tent. And then they're also setting up the booths in such a way to keep about 6 feet apart. A number of things that we've been able to do at the statewide level, not only providing guidance in that area, but the governor ordered the Department of Elections to work with the Medical Reserve Corps. The Medical Reserve Corps was founded after 9/11. And it was a way for medical professionals to volunteer their time to assist in various ways. And so we have volunteers positioned at certain polling places to help ensure the sanitary conditions of the polling place and to help enforce social distancing where applicable. The other thing we've been able to do is provide a number of pieces of supplies and resources for the localities to use at the polling locations. For example, single-use pens. They'll be able to once you're going to get a free pen this year if you vote in the May 19th election and probably the June 23rd election. We still encourage you to vote absentee, but you know, if you have to go to the polling places, you'll get rewarded with a pen. The other thing you get is single-use folders. So you'll get a folder to put, you know, so you can put your ballot in there and then carry it to the machine and place it in the machine. That ensures that those things aren't being used from person to person. A number of other things are occurring. The election officers have been outfitted with masks, face shields. There's hand sanitizer and disinfectant placed in every polling location, and we've provided those directly to the localities so they can supply the polling places there. We encourage you, if you're going to show up on election day in person to vote, bring a mask, cover your face. We ask you that you bring your own sanitizer and you know, and take the precautions that we encourage and the governor has been encouraging since day one, the social distancing, et cetera. So it's you know, we're obviously another thing is the absentee ballots. Encouraging people to vote absentee will ensure that we have less people in the polls on actual election day, which will help encourage and be able to enforce the social distancing.
Okay, that's a great kind of segue into my next question, which is with these absentee ballots, it's reserved for people with the disability or illness typically, and these, you know, not in all cases are they going to be ill with COVID. You know, are there any chances of them being sort of in violation of the law, or how will that work?
So it's actually not unprecedented. In 2000, I think it was 2010, during the swine flu epidemic, the Department of Elections and the governor at the time implemented similar guidance. And so, yes, this is an opportunity. My disability or illness is the reason code that we've provided. Obviously, after July 1st, there won't be a requirement for a reason, but reason code 2A and my disability or illness is the best way we can ensure that if you are concerned about being exposed, being in person at the polling location, then this is the best opportunity for you to vote absentee and ensure your health and safety.
Okay. All right, so the Attorney General has entered into an agreement to waive the witness signature for absentee ballots. Now that it appears that more people will be able to submit an absentee ballot, what authority allows him to enter into this agreement, and how will the Department of Elections guard against potential fraud related to this?
Sure. So we were actually sued about the witness signature requirement. I will say this. So we're one of 9 states that requires a witness signature or a notary, and some states actually require a notary to cast an absentee ballot. We were sued for that requirement, and we get sued all the time on laws that we have to enforce. That's part of being in the executive branch. So we got sued. The Attorney General's office worked with the group that sued us to come to a consent decree. The consent decree was agreed upon, and the consent decree, and I'll describe that in a second, but the consent decree was signed by the judge. So it becomes effectively the judge's order and the judge's ruling. And so that is that was the process by which that went. So the authority actually came from the judicial branch in that particular instance. Now, that said, the consent decree says very clearly that the witness signature can be left off if the individual does not have the ability, because of the social distancing requirements, to gain a witness for their ballot. And so our guidance out to the localities and the guidance that goes into the absentee ballot. So if you were to request an absentee ballot for the June 23rd primary, you would get in the mail the ballot, but you'd also get a slip of paper that says, if you are unable, due to the situation, the current situation, to obtain a signature from a witness signature, then you can send it back without one. It doesn't say you don't need a witness signature, so have fun. It says, under these circumstances, you would not need to obtain a witness signature. And so that is how we're working through that and handling that situation. I think the consent decree was really clear about what we needed to do, and we've been providing on our social media information to that regard.
Okay. And I'm looking at the questions. I see we're getting a good number of questions from people who are participating, but I still have one more. Here in Virginia, we have elections every year. It's always an election year. And so there has been some talk about the Virginia House of Delegates could have elections for up to 3 years because of the way that COVID-19 has impacted everything. Can you kind of touch on this? Is this realistic? What scenarios could this potentially cause this to happen?
Well, let me, as a history nerd, especially a Virginia politics history nerd, go back in time a little bit. So in the 1980 Decennial Census, the General Assembly received the redistricting information as they do every year or every 10 years, usually in March. And so there was a lot of back and forth, and every time they released a redistricting plan, they were sued, they weren't sued. Back then, the Department of Justice had to review all of those. Anyway, the Department of Justice rejected it. They still let the election go on, but as a result, they had to redo the redistricting and then come back the following year. So there was, in the early 80s, 3 years of House of Delegates elections. Just a little historic fun fact there. That said, typically in a redistricting year, we will get the data to the General Assembly in March of 2011 and 2001. And then we were anticipating getting it this 21 in March. What ends up usually happening, or how it's happened in the past, is the primary election, which is usually held in June, is delayed until August. And then that gives us time to take the line changes, the district changes that the General Assembly has implemented, and put them into our voter registration database, and then have those elections with the correct voters in the correct spot and the candidates on the correct districts. And in that case, you have the primary election, and then you can turn around and you can have the November election. But really, that August timeline is a pretty tight timeline. That whole year is a really tight timeline in order to turn around and have these elections. Unfortunately, you know, moving district lines in a voter registration database isn't as simple as just clicking and dragging, right? Like it's a very intensive administrative process. So if as has been discussed that there will be a delay in receiving those redistricting lines, that could potentially require an election 3 years in a row. There's precedence for it. I am not very good at judging the future or predicting the future, so I am not going to go into whether that's going to happen. But I can say that those are the issues that people are talking about, and that's what prompts that kind of a question and that discussion. So it's a good question. I think what we're going to do is focus on the May 19th, June 23rd, and November elections, and then and then we'll worry about the redistricting year. But I can promise you the Department of Elections is well prepared for redistricting, no matter what ends up happening.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So if it's okay, we've got some questions submitted by some those that are online. I'm just going to kind of ask them, and we'll see how many we can get through in the next few minutes, and then before we hand it back over to Victoria. So first question is, and you kind of touched on this, how are mail-in ballots validated to make sure they're connected to a legally registered voter?
Sure. So as I explained, you have to apply. When you apply for a ballot, you have to provide certain information. So especially if you apply by mail, or if you apply through our online process, you have to provide your name, your date of birth, and the last 4 digits of your social security number. When you apply and it's determined that you are valid and can receive a ballot, we mail that out to you. The locality will mail it out to you, and it has to be mailed to the residents on the registration of record. So it's not mailed anywhere else. It's mailed directly to that person with that person's information. Then again, you go through the process. You have to fill out the form, the ballot, the envelopes, and then you mail it back. And then that information again is checked by the locality to ensure all the information is there. So there's there's a lot of checks across the system. If you do it in person, you don't necessarily need to have your last 4 digits, but you're provided, it's in person, and they're provided their date of birth, and that whole process goes through. And of course, throughout the entire process, the localities, the registrars are checking the database. So if you've already submitted a ballot, for example, you're not going to be able to submit a second one. The system will be able to tell them that a ballot's already been submitted and received.
Okay. I think we're always want to make sure that those that are serving overseas or in the military, that we're providing them every means possible to vote. One question is, are there any changes or updates for dealing with absentee voting for deployed military personnel?
Not really any major changes. The great thing about our overseas voters, federal law and state law are pretty great in helping them. So if you're overseas, you can apply and have your ballot delivered to you within 45 days of the start of the election. The date of the election. Further, in certain situations, you can request different kinds of ballots depending on your situation. And so there's some options there, and we encourage people to go to our website and review those options. The biggest thing, I think, is that in certain situations for uniformed and overseas citizens, you can request the ballot be emailed to you. Now, that's just the ballot being emailed. And then it still needs to be mailed back with all the important information. But there are a lot of great options available to our overseas citizens and deployed military personnel. The great news too is about our mailing system when it comes to our state employee, Department of State employees and military personnel, are unaffected for the most part against any disruptions to a a localized mail service. So we do our best to treat those who are deployed to ensure that their vote counts.
Okay. I think we've covered a lot. We've covered a lot of the questions that those on the webinar have had. I kind of want to open it up just real quick for any final thoughts that you might have as far as preparations going forward for the upcoming elections. You know, of course, we want to remind everybody about checking their polling place, but if you have any final thoughts as we head into the election season here for those that are on the webinar and listening by phone.
Well, you know, we've covered just about everything. I do encourage everybody to vote absentee if they have the option. You know, just reducing the number of people at the polling place is a positive thing. Secondly, you know, do check your information, as I stated it earlier. But I'd like to talk about just real quick some inspiration. At the beginning of this pandemic, as we said, there was no playbook. We were all kind of, I don't want to say running around like chickens with our heads cut off, but it was a lot to figure out in a very quick turnaround. We had elections coming up, and we'd never had an election where or at least I haven't had an election where you had to keep people physically distant. And Virginia is set up for in-person elections. And so there was a lot of thinking and figuring out, and I'm just amazed at how many people who are not in the high risk category, understanding that this was an opportunity for them to serve. So we've had a lot of people step up and volunteer to work as election officers, and to serve the Commonwealth in that way is so critical. As you probably have noticed, our election officers tend to be older citizens, and they tend to be in the high risk category. So understandably, they were concerned about conducting an election and working on an election. We've had just an unprecedented number of people show up and say, hey, I want to serve, please let me help. And that has been truly awe-inspiring. And so if that message resonates with you, please go to our website. We have a form there where you can sign up to be an election officer. This is a great opportunity to go and help the voices of your fellow citizens be heard. You work in a nonpartisan fashion. It's a great opportunity to see the inside of the process. I think a lot of people assume elections just happen. My favorite story to tell everybody is I go to a cookout in the summer and they say, oh, you work in elections, so what do you do the other 3 years? It's a long, very difficult process that we have to make sure that when you are done voting, that you had an enjoyable experience without any difficulty. That's what we work toward all year long. And this is an opportunity to kind of pull back the curtain and see how it's done, and at the same time serve your fellow citizens of the Commonwealth. And then if you're working in November, I mean, being a part of such a historic election, every 4 years we have pretty major elections, and they're always historic. So I encourage anybody who's willing and able to sign up as an officer of election and serve during this very difficult time.
Great. Well, you know, Chris, we really do appreciate the work that you're doing, and thankful for the sacrifice, especially during this time as we're dealing with a pandemic. And just want you to know that we at the Family Foundation, we do pray for all of our government officials. It's not a partisan thing. We just pray for your health and your safety. And I know that this is a busy season for you and your agency, but just know that we're praying, and that we thank you for this opportunity to be able to ask questions, to get some information about upcoming elections. Hopefully this has been helpful to everyone on the webinar. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and kick it back over to Victoria.
All right. Well, thank you so much for such a great conversation, Todd and Chris. We are truly, truly grateful. I think our folks definitively really had just a lot of questions. Hopefully that lighting's a little better there. Sorry about that. And so as we wrap up, just a reminder, on our website, you can find the information about the simulcast. You can find the information about EQUIP, our summer program for students, about our religious freedom webinar tomorrow, focused on these non-discrimination laws and how they impact schools and the pending litigation that we expect. And just want to say, every year is an election year in Virginia. I love going to national meetings, and they always all think that they're synced up and they only have elections every other year and that kind of thing. And then there's Virginia, one or two other states that's on the odd year, and we've always got an election. So it's critical. And I would say, I personally have never had to use an absentee ballot. I'm always kind of focused on elections, here for elections. And all of a sudden, when I realized this June date had changed, I am hoping to be at the beach on June 23rd. So all the more reason to pay attention to these dates, because they're moving this year. They've changed, not as early as they usually are. And so some of you might find that you actually are supposed to be somewhere else. So be thinking now about getting that absentee, and also just avoiding being in a place with a lot of people. If that's, if you're a vulnerable or a risk factor person, you might want to just simply get that absentee, as Chris was encouraging you, so you don't have to be in the crowd. So with that, I'm going to say thanks for today. We're looking forward to next week, again, focusing on the pro-life efforts that have been thwarted in the middle of the pandemic with Cheryl Britt. And we will see you next week. Thanks.